What is it to gain the world if you lose your souls? Or to put it a different way, what is it to gain the admiration of another if you lose your convictions? Happy Thursday. Good afternoon to you. Happy Thursday. Hope you and your family are doing well. Pastor Stecker here with Grace Lutheran Church in Nashua, New Hampshire, as we continue our Bible study on the Psalms, understanding the prayers for the journey of life. So today, we're going to tackle another often confusing topic in the Bible, and it's confusing, or it may seem confusing to us, because we seemingly run into different messages at different places in the Scriptures. But there is a lesson that we can learn from this. Let me put it this way. Let me give you an illustration in hopes that this will help. So when we run into these seemingly contradictory messages in the Bible, it's less like, let's say, mom telling you that you can't play in the street, and then dad coming and telling you that you can. In other words, two contradictory messages that are just opposed to each other. In fact, it's more like mom telling you that you can't have chocolate, maybe because dinner's almost ready, and then dad telling you that you can have chocolate at a different time and place, maybe after a wonderful Easter dinner. In other words, these two seemingly opposite views should actually paint for us a picture of a deeper truth. In the example, it would be that chocolate should only be enjoyed at certain times. Seemingly opposite on the surface, but really they work together to uncover a deeper truth that's tougher for the child to understand. And we are the child in the illustration. So what's the topic at hand today? Well, it's how do we relate to those who not only don't share our faith, but live a life that goes against our values vehemently. Now, I'm going to guess that each of you have come up with a different answer in your head, and probably you even have scripture verses to back this up. Let me give you some examples. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul says, "But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one." In 2 Corinthians 6, Paul says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness?" And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, one of my favorite, he says, "Bad company ruins good morals." So if we were to stop with just those three verses, and we could look at other ones as well, it would seem that the message is that we are, for the most part, supposed to distance ourselves from people who are lawless, bad company, or have bad influence on us. However, we can look at some other Bible verses. Jesus says in Mark chapter 2, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." And of course, the Pharisees and the scribes were the very ones who grumbled at Jesus, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So, are you confused? Well, you should be, because there isn't a slogan answer that I can give you to the question, how do you relate with those who are, as Paul and Jesus calls, workers of lawlessness? Okay, so let's explore. Because maybe there is some deeper truth that we can learn here. One that can't be understood by simply looking at one verse, but rather by looking at the Bible as a whole. Should we dive in? Okay. So the approach that we're going to take today, because we're doing a Bible study on the Psalms, is to look at what the Psalms teach us on this matter. And then we're going to grow in our understanding from those Psalms, using them as a window to look into the Bible at this topic. And the term we're going to use to summarize this conversation is connivance. You might understand, or you might get the word conniving from there. Connivance is basically the willingness to be loosely involved and part of a wrongdoing, or to be with those who are doing it. In other words, being guilty by association. So to hear what the psalmists have to say on the matter, in Psalm 26, verses 4 and 5, the psalmist says, "I do not sit with men of falsehood, nor do I consort with hypocrites. I hate the assembly of evildoers, and I will not sit with the wicked." In other words, not only do we refrain from falsehood and doing wickedness, but we don't even dwell with those who do it. Now moving on to Psalm 31 verse 6, the psalmist says, I hate those who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust the Lord. He says, hates those who worship other gods. Now, to understand what hate means here, hate means not necessarily just a strong emotion, but a steady opposition towards. So it's not like I hate Ohio State, but it's like a soldier who opposes enemy forces as they approach his station. Psalm 50 says, if you see a thief, you are pleased with him, and you keep company with adulterers. In other words, you're consenting to a thief and his ways. You're pleased to keep company with them. And then in Psalm 139, verse 21, which is one of the Psalms that we studied, the psalmist says, do I not hate those who hate you, Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? It's almost as if it's thrown in at the end of a psalm of hope and praise. It's a very beautiful psalm. It's like finishing a nice conversation with my mom and saying, do we not hate human traffickers? How wicked are they? See, God puts before us a call to live a life following his ways, but also to avoid connivance, or being associated with those who openly reject his ways. Now, before moving forward, just like in our last video on vengeance and cursings in the Bible, what we need to do is revisit our ground rules for letting Scripture interpret Scripture. So first, we of course can't explain these verses away. There is an important truth for us to learn here. But two, we also can't take this teaching in these verses alone and have it override other teachings in the Bible. We have to let Scripture interpret Scripture. Just like how in our first example, if mom says no to chocolate, that doesn't mean that we can never have chocolate, but it does mean there's a reason why mom said no, and we best learn to understand why if we're going to grow in wisdom. So the rules for today are this. We know as Christians that completely avoiding the society of those that we might think wicked, judging our neighbors and looking down our nose at them, and thinking ourselves too good for other people, that's just not a Christian virtue. It's not even a true thought, if we're honest. In fact, it's an example of Pharisaism, which was one of the things that Jesus most vehemently opposed in his life. So rule number one, this is not a green light for us to be self-righteous, Pharisaical, holier-than-thou groups of people. That's just not the Christian way, nor was it the Jewish way. Well, it wasn't supposed to be, but that was at least the sin of the day when Jesus came and lived among the Jews. But that doesn't mean that this is the sin of the psalmists, which is why rule number two is there's actually some really good advice for us to draw out of their wisdom and their teachings here in the Psalms. So, rules established, let's first unpack the issue of connivance, what the psalmists are talking about, and then we'll unpack the caveat of why we shouldn't become pretentious Pharisees. After this, we should be able to draw a safe and polished conclusion on how we understand these verses in the Psalms. And by the way, this is a really good lesson for us to learn. Okay, the issue can best be framed like this. Imagine for yourself now public figures who are prominently wicked or tyrannical. Maybe they mistreat their spouse or others. Maybe they take advantage of systems. Maybe you can think of artists who put things out that are pretty atrocious. Now, have you ran into this? Now notice that the general rule in our society, as it is now, is that they are for the most part praised or dealt with in an overly friendly manner, despite obvious wickedness. In fact, Christians as a whole often identify themselves with these public figures who promote the very things that they most adamantly stand against. Often we say to ourselves, if we are just nice to them, then surely they'll come around. And so our whole strategy of dealing with these very negative and immoral movements in our day is one of passivity. And then usually we will picture Jesus sitting with tax collectors and sinners and say, well, see, I'm supposed to do the same. I'm being nice and kind and open to others just like Jesus was. Now, I need to take a step back for a second here to make sure that I don't misspeak. First, I'm not saying that I know the answer to the challenge here. This is a very difficult question that we're trying to unpack. I'm also not saying that Christians need to boycott anything that they disagree with. I'm certainly not saying that Christians should be like the Westboro Baptist Church, if you've ever heard of them, who go around protesting and causing riots and chaos in response to things. I'm also not saying that Jesus sitting with tax collectors shouldn't be on the forefront of our mind. What I am saying is this. We often use loving others, or being kind, or the picture of Jesus with the tax collectors. We'll look at Jesus with the tax collectors more in a minute. As an excuse to say we don't have to stand up for any of the virtues or teachings that our God demands of us. And to be honest, there should be at least a little self-reflection of who we hold up as heroes and what we expose ourselves to on a regular basis. If you see a thief, you are pleased with him, and you keep the company of adulterers. Now, turning to Jesus with the tax collectors, there's another important clarification that we should make on the subject. And that is that when we look at Jesus' life, he treats and interacts differently towards very bad people who are powerful, prosperous, and impenitent, in comparison with those who might be sinful or wicked but are also outcasts and downtrodden. Lewis puts it this way: if they are outcast, poor, and miserable, whose wickedness obviously is not paid, then every Christian knows the answer. Christ speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well, Christ with the woman taken in adultery. Christ dealing with publicans is our example. I mean, of course, that his humility, his love, his total indifference to the social discredit and misrepresentation he might incur are examples for us. Now, this helps us get to a very important clarification. Christ was continually looked down upon because of his association with these people, because they were outcasts, by the community and by the leaders and the prosperous around him. But his humility, love, and lack of motivation to boost his own self led him to help these people. However, at constant harm to himself, he always distanced from and rebuked those bad men who would have helped bolster his wealth, fame, and made his life easier. In other words, he lifted up those who were down, but he didn't approve or show false kindness to those who spread lawlessness by their public shows of sin, and that those people gained popularity from it. See, here's where the self-reflection for us comes in. Because what I find is that normally our temptation is to be attached to public figures or important and popular people, even just at school or at work, who may be crude, dishonest, spiteful, and gain fame for those things. And normally what happens is we gain fame or applause or become better off by association with these people. In other words, it's much easier on us, and often very beneficial for us, to connive with these people, and that's when we make the excuse and lie to ourselves and say, our motivation is the same as Jesus with the publicans. But that's just not the case. We aren't conniving with them in order to help them, but in order to be helped by them, to enjoy and share in their fame and their popularity, or simply to be more accepted in society by being connected with these things that they create and stand for. Now, do you see the difference? Because this really is important. Now, of course, I'm not saying to you that this is always the case, or that it is even the case for you. You may very well be connected with people who at times are wicked or crude, or anti-Christian or cruel, and maybe mock things that we hold sacred, and you may be friends with them for good intentions. You really can. Or perhaps just because you've been lifelong friends with them and you don't want to break that friendship, and that may be perfectly fine and good. I certainly have friends that I don't agree with everything they say. Many don't share my faith, and some say things that I just have to shake my head at. But the takeaway, and this is very important, is not to tell you to go off and start breaking off friendships. That's not the takeaway. That is not the goal. That is not the Christian teaching. But the takeaway is this: if you find yourself laughing at or silently supporting and even encouraging things that you confess to oppose when in front of certain people, this is a sign that they are actually influencing you, not the other way around. And if you're so motivated to appease them by abandoning your own beliefs and convictions, it is probably because you really want to be accepted by them for your own personal gain. In other words, this is the opposite approach that Jesus has with people when he deals with them. He, at constant loss to himself, would approach all people, but he always stood up for what was right and against what was wrong. He never took the hanging fruit that said, I'll just agree and support this, and then my life will be good or easier or better. In fact, that's just what Satan tempted him with when he said in the wilderness, worship me, and then I'll give you the world. Okay, so now we're going to turn the page for right now away from connivance, which we were just talking about, and towards the issue of being pretentious or thinking thyself holier and too good for others. Now, we actually unpacked a lot of this point already in our conversation about connivance, that Christ is our example to approach others in humility, meekness, and love, and not in a condescending manner. Now, while there could be a whole series probably on this topic, I find that we are more acquainted with an understanding of this point than the previous point of connivance. So I won't take the same amount of time to break this down, but I do want to bring out 2 important points for you. First, many of you, and myself included in this, at certain times in our life, we've been reached and we've been influenced by people who were more rooted in their faith, or maybe had greater discipline, and if I were to be honest, whom at that time I was probably the bad influence on. Being reached by them, I'm very thankful for those people. I needed those strong people in my life, and I would be quite selfish if I wasn't willing to be that for other people as I grow in my faith. See, we are called to disciple or to help lift up others in the faith, and even those whom we encounter who don't have any faith, or for one reason or another, haven't had good love and care and guidance in their life. We do need to be there for them. It's one of our Christian callings. In fact, it may be one of the most important and high callings outside of our own Christian practice of church, prayer, and the sacrament. That being said, it's also important for us to understand that Jesus was Jesus, and of course we are not. Lewis gives us 2 important caveats, we can call them, to take to heart in relationship with this important teaching, and it is very important. Basically what he does here is he inserts wisdom into this discussion and maybe our very good intentions. This first quote builds off of our previous quote from C.S. Lewis, and this is what he says. Jesus' total indifference to the social discredit and misrepresentation he might incur are examples for us. Not, heaven knows, that any of us who was not specially qualified to do so by priesthood, age, old acquaintance, or the earnest request of the sinners themselves, could without insolence and presumption assume the least trace of his authority to rebuke and pardon. One has to be very careful lest the desire to patronize and the itch to be a busybody should disguise itself as a vocation to help the fallen, or tend to obscure our knowledge that we are fallen, perhaps in God's eyes far more so than ourselves. Okay, so what's Lewis saying here? He's reminding us that Jesus was the Son of God whose calling was to go out and die for and redeem the sins of the world. So when he rebuked and corrected others, he did so with the ultimate authority of God and as one who was sinless himself. When he gave advice, it was perfect. This meant that he was qualified for every situation he went into. Now for us, Lewis points out that there are situations that will present themselves to us. Acquaintances, friends, younger people who look up to us for guidance, or if you're called to a position like a pastor or a teacher who are placed in a position to specifically be there for those wandering and looking for guidance. In these positions, we are called to put our best foot forward, and of course it won't be perfect. We aren't the perfect Son of God, but he promises to be with us. However, this is different than feeling puffed up and taking it upon ourselves to go correct those around us. For example, I knew a person growing up who came to Christianity, or at least he found a sudden newfound enthusiasm for Christianity, and he changed some of his ways, but then he took it upon himself to become the moral police for those around him. This is what Lewis is warning against. Another way to put it may be, many a woman have taken it upon themselves to date and marry a man in hopes of fixing him. Now, this doesn't normally work, and it can often lead to challenges down the road. Perhaps Lewis' second quote will bring this to a concluding point. What makes this contact with wicked people so difficult is that to handle the situation successfully requires not merely good intentions, even with humility and courage thrown in. It may call for social and even intellectual talents which God has not given us. It is therefore not self-righteousness, but mere prudence to avoid it when we can. The psalmists were not quite wrong when they described the good man as avoiding the seat of the scornful, and fearing to consort with the ungodly, lest he should eat of, or, shall we say, laugh at, admire, approve, justify, such things as please them. In other words, we may often have good intentions of changing others, but more often than not, we do find them changing us. It's just the reality. We'll find ourselves sometimes laughing at, admiring, approving, and even defending what is wrong in others. This is why the psalmists, Paul and Jesus, warn us about who we surround ourselves with. It's dangerous to us, and not in a way of maybe facing persecution, but actually in abandoning and turning our back on our faith and our convictions. This never happened to Jesus, but it certainly does happen to us. So let's bring this to a conclusion. If I could summarize what we've talked about, I'll say simply this. The rule of thumb is this. God will place into our lives people that we will be called to disciple, care for, help out, and allow them to lean on us. Don't shy away from that. This is a holy and right Christian calling. God is using you to be there for those people. But approach these situations with prayerful humility, making sure that you aren't doing it for your own glory or well-being, but for theirs. And also to beware that you are extra careful to understand your faith and your convictions. And always, above all, beware of connivance, which is where you surround yourself with those who embrace wickedness and find yourself laughing at, admiring, approving, and even defending what's wrong with others. This is a real danger, and we should always be ready to run from them. As Jesus says, what is it to gain the world if you lose your souls? Or to put it a different way, what is it to gain the admiration of another if you lose your convictions and your faith? Well, this brings us to the end of our conversation. I was talking with Diana yesterday, and we were talking about how I find myself being drawn to these delicate topics. This one certainly was. But I find that in my own life that these delicate subjects are often the most beneficial for myself, because I often find that I may have misunderstood something or that I've taken my own presuppositions for granted. And the Bible actually has something to say to correct me. And it always imparts a new way of looking at things. So thank you for joining me for this Bible study. We will continue next week on both Tuesday and Thursday. And my goal is to send out an email to you by Sunday to tell you what those topics are going to be with a very, very brief outline. And my goal for that is that you can then receive that, you can reflect on the topic, and then if you have any questions, you can email me those questions, and I will try to pull those into my preparation for the Bible study and address some of those questions as we go through. So I'll send those out by Sunday, and then for Tuesday's Bible study, I'll need those questions in by Monday morning, let's say at around 9 or 10. And then for Thursday's Bible study, I'll want those in by, Tuesday evening at around 2. So I'll send out the information in the email, but thank you for joining us today. God be with you. Have a wonderful day.